So these soldiers take the field in late February and discover to their great surprise that the North Country gets really, really cold in the wintertime. In fact, General Crook was the first to engage, stationed at Fort Fetterman down there at the bottom, and departing from the fort on March 1st, he and about 700 men started marching northward, and it was so cold that the temperatures were so low that the thermometers that they had with them couldn't even measure it. It went lower than their thermometers did. In fact, when they would make camp, the soldiers had to take their forks and put them on the hot coals of the fire for a few minutes before they could use them. Otherwise, the metal on the forks would freeze to their tongue. So I'd hate to be the first person that found out that was a problem. Anyway, this is in March, and in January they had expected, though they hadn't really expected, all those Lakotas to travel in weather like that to make their way back for that meeting that was held on short notice. Anyway, they head north, and you'll see they pass by a couple of other forts, Fort Reno and Fort Phil Kearny, both of which say ruins next to them. These are two of the three forts, the third one being Fort C.F. Smith over the border in Montana, that had been built along the old Bozeman Trail that is part of the agreement in the Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, the Army had agreed to abandon. So I would imagine that was kind of eerie in the dead of winter in the howling wind and blowing snow, going by the ruins of these abandoned forts. Eventually, they made their way up into what is now Montana along the Tongue River, and their scouts saw two Native American warriors whom they identified as Ogallala Sioux. And so Crook decided to divide his forces. They took off in pursuit, not really in pursuit, they were tracking those two Indians. And as they got to the Powder River, Crook decided to send Colonel Reynolds, who was under his command, with the majority of the force to attack, to find the village that those two warriors had come from and attack it. And Crook stayed behind with about 300 men, so Reynolds had almost 400. And so off they set to try to find this village, and they located the general vicinity of it and started drawing up plans to make an attack. The village was along the west bank of the Powder River, which was frozen solid at that time. Here is a contemporary 21st century modern photograph of the site viewed from the south looking to the north, with a white triangle there representing the location of the village. The scouts had been correct that they were Ogallala Sioux they had seen, and the assumption was therefore made this was an Ogallala village, but it was not. It was actually a northern Cheyenne village with a handful of Ogallala visiting, led by, they were members of the Soreback Band, led by He Dog, who had recently gotten married, by the way, had his new wife with him, and several members of his family that had just come basically passing through on their way to the Ogallala camps to visit with the Cheyenne. In fact, there were 50 or 60 lodges in the village, and around 8 of them were the visiting Lakota. Okay, the picture on the right is kind of a zoomed out picture. It is not the same location. It's a different part of the river. But I just wanted to show you what the topography is like on a larger scale. So you'll see, picture on the left, the land's pretty flat there along the banks of the river. But as you go farther away from the river, then it rises first into bluffs and then into a very steep mountainous area. The river has over time cut its way deep into that. So bear that in mind. When the force commanded by the colonel arrives, they're going to have to descend down these steep bluffs to get to the village. Now, they had not only been mistaken in what kind of village it was, although they really didn't care because they were after the Lakota and the Cheyenne, the Lakota allies as well. Well, some of those mistakes are going to be a lot more impactful than just knowing which group of Indians you're fighting. The picture on the left is what Reynolds planned to do. All right, so the circled area is where they thought the village was. And so he divided his force, which was 6 companies, into 3 battalions of 2 companies each. And they were separated, and they were going to come from different directions. The plan was the battalion there on the bottom to the south was going to go straight into the village, attacking them. Then the battalion in the middle was going to come at them directly from the west, reinforcing that 1st battalion. The 3rd battalion on top there to the north, they were going to skirt around the village and head upriver just a little bit and seize control of these bluffs. That's the darker orange areas at the base of the mountains. So they were going to get up into those bluffs so that they could fire down on any Indians who escaped from the village that was being attacked and tried to run away north along the river. So that was the plan, but there was only one problem. That's not where the village was. The village was actually about 1 mile to the north. So those bottom 2 battalions got there, and there was no village there. A little bit farther, though, up the river to the north, there was the pony herd, containing about 1,000 horses. And they were able to capture about 700 of the Indians' horses. Meanwhile, that 3rd battalion, who was supposed to get up in there and hold the bluffs, they're headed north to do that, and they see the village. Well, one of the 2 companies does. They actually got separated. The 2nd company was slow in following behind because they had misjudged how difficult the terrain would be in winter. So essentially, it is just 1 company out of the 6 that stumbles upon the village and rushes in to attack it. So they come in, making their attack, and the warriors gather together, the women and children and old people, and flee northward to get them to safety. And then the warriors immediately turn back southward, and they actually seize, as you can see up there in the upper left of the 2nd picture, the warriors, the Cheyenne and their Oglala visitors, they managed to seize the bluffs, so they're able to fire down on the soldiers who were there ransacking the village. And as they're doing that, eventually the other soldiers make their way up and join in, well, there's not much to attack in the village because almost everyone's gone, and are now firing on them from the hills. However, Colonel Reynolds gives the order to destroy the village, to destroy everything in it, so that it cannot be used by the Indians. And like with other cases we have discussed, that was a lot of their winter provisions, a lot of the meat they had stored up to last them, and a lot of their possessions, their robes, their buffalo robes, their blankets, because they had fled so quickly out of necessity. They had to leave that stuff behind. So the soldiers were ordered to burn that stuff. The soldiers, who were freezing to death, 66 of them had frostbite, and who were half-starved because they hadn't brought enough provisions, were ordered to destroy the buffalo robes and blankets and the meat. Now, a few of them managed to pilfer a buffalo robe or two for use later on, but that was not that was against orders, and for the most part, that stuff was destroyed. Meanwhile, another group of Cheyenne from that village had been returning from the east, where they had been hunting. And so they hear the gunfire and they come up, and you can see that red arrow pointing downward to the far right. They get there and they also start firing on the soldiers, and some of them slip down the river and go back to the pony herd, where Reynolds had forgot to order anyone to stand guard over these 700 stolen horses, and the Cheyennes steal 500 of them back. Finally, after 5 hours in the howling wind and blowing snow and taking shots at one another, Reynolds orders his men to withdraw. Now, the Indian women and children and old people made their way to the village of Crazy Horse, but that was a 3-day walk away through that weather, and quite a few of the women and children and old people froze to death or died of exposure along the way. Now, so far as the actual battle itself, there weren't that many casualties. There were 4 soldiers killed and 6 wounded. There were 3 Indians killed, 2 Cheyenne and 1 Lakota, and 2 wounded. Of the 4 soldiers who were killed, 3 of them were, killed dead in their tracks, shot down. The 4th one was wounded, I think, in the hip, and so he wasn't mobile. And when Reynolds ordered his men to withdraw, retreating from the enemy fire, they did not retrieve the 3 dead bodies, and they didn't even retrieve the wounded guy, who the Cheyenne got a hold of and cut into pieces. So that was capping off a very bad day for him. So this was the first engagement between the U.S. Army and the Lakota and Cheyenne in the Great Sioux War of 1876. And it wasn't really that auspicious a beginning. When Reynolds rejoined Crook south of the village, they then made their way back down to Fort Fetterman, had a couple of minor skirmishes along the way. And then when they returned to the fort, General Crook had Colonel Reynolds court-martialed for dereliction of duty and gross incompetence for several things. Number one, for not having his entire command come in together at the same time to attack the Indians, so that only 1/6 of his men initially attacked them, leaving them vulnerable. Number two, burning that stuff that the soldiers really could have used. And then number three, losing all those horses they had just captured. Well, they didn't lose all of them. They only lost, 5/7 of them. So he was actually found guilty in his court-martial, and he was sentenced to a 1-year suspension from his rank and from command and from active duty. Fortunately for him, he had a good friend from his early days in the Mexican-American War, who was now president, U.S. Grant, who granted him a reprieve. But nonetheless, at the end of a year, Reynolds just retired. So he is one of those colonels who did not go on to become a general again. Again, he had been a general. He'd been one of Grant's generals during the Civil War, but it was one of those brevet rank things that had been reduced. So There was the first battle. A couple of results from this initial attack, unprovoked attack, really, by the U.S. Army on this village. For one thing, there were a sizable minority of Lakotas who were out there in the unceded lands who had been talking about going back onto the reservation. That's what the government did. They wanted to negotiate. They had been talking about, well, maybe we'll go in then when the weather gets better in early spring and we can travel. Well, they're not going to do that now. In fact, there were quite a few people who were on the reservation who left and came out and joined the ones who were in the unceded lands. Second thing, the Cheyenne. They probably would have acted in support of their Lakota allies anyhow, but the fact that they weren't even involved in these discussions and the U.S. Army attacked one of their villages really ticked them off and even more firmly cemented the idea that they were going to be resisting along with their allies. The United States Army thereupon decided, hey, let's wait till it gets warmer to do this again. So they planned their next offensive for June. Meanwhile, when spring arrived, upwards of 300 or more Crow and Shoshone offered their services to General Crook. They were at war with the Lakota and Cheyenne already, farther to the west, and had been for a very long time. There were also about 100 Pawnee scouts. The Pawnee had also been at war with the Lakota and Cheyenne for a very long time, and in more recent memory, in 1873, a group of Ogallala and Brule Lakotas had attacked a group of Pawnee who were on a hunting trip in Nebraska and killed 156 people at a place called Massacre Canyon. So they were happy to go help kill some Lakota. And the Arikara as well, traditional enemies of the Lakota, including Bloody Knife, who was had long been Custer's favorite scout and someone he described as his friend, even though Custer, who's pictured here sitting down, had on one occasion during the Black Hills expedition in 1874 gotten, he had gone into a mad fury and actually shot at Bloody Knife, but they forgave each other. Custer actually had about 40 Arikara scouts with him. So sometimes people will say how they will note how ironic it is that the native peoples were divided among themselves, with some of them on the side of the U.S. of the whites. But it is necessary to remember that there were long-standing enmities between some of these tribes, and the enmity between the Crows and the Lakotas would continue for a very long time. When the summer campaign began in June 1876, the plan was to have the army divided into 3 columns, each approaching from a different direction. The Dakota column, as it was called, commanded by General Terry, coming out of Fort Abraham Lincoln near what is now Bismarck, North Dakota. That included Custer's 7th Cavalry. Then there was the Montana column, commanded by Colonel Gibbon, coming out of Fort Ellis near Bozeman, Montana. And there was the Wyoming column, commanded by General Crook, coming out of Fort Fetterman. The plan was to converge together and catch the Lakotas and Cheyennes in a pincher, to converge on them from 3 different directions at once. Now, as promised earlier, here are the major leaders on the Native American side in the Great Sioux War, which was also a Great Cheyenne War. On the top row, you've got Lakota leaders, all of whom we've previously discussed. In fact, the first four, we've seen their pictures before. You've got from the Hunkpapa Sitting Bull, of course, but also Gall and Rain in the Face. Gall, by the way, led raids in the late 1860s, early 1870s against the Arikara that killed Bloody Knife's two brothers and later his son, which was part of the reason that he hated Gall and the Lakota so much. Anyway, then you've got Crazy Horse of the Ogallala and his cousin, Touch the Clouds, who is Miniconjou. He got his name from the fact that he was a tall fellow. He was the youngest son of Lone Horn, the really elderly guy who had gone to Washington a couple of years or a year before all this happened. His older brother, Spotted Elk, alias Bigfoot, supported the war, but did not engage in any of the fighting physically. On the bottom, you've got some of the Cheyenne leaders. You've got Two Moons, and it was actually his village on the Powder River that Colonel Reynolds had attacked. And you've also got Little Wolf, whose name is actually mistranslated into English. It should be Little Coyote, but Little Wolf is how he's known in the history books. And similarly with this other fellow, Morning Star, which is his actual Cheyenne name, but his Lakota friends gave him the name Dull Knife, and that's how he tends to be known in the history books as well. So beyond the Great Sioux War, we'll be talking about Little Wolf and Morning Star, Dull Knife in particular, in a different context a little later on. And here are some Lakota leaders, all of whom we have talked about before, who were, quote unquote, agency Indians, who remained on the agency and who were opposed to the idea of going to war, despite the fact that all of them had military experience, specifically even against the United States. But Red Cloud there and Spotted Tail, you'll recall, had, along with Lone Horn, gone up and met with President Grant, whom they had met with several times before. And even before that, back in the war in the 1860s, Red Cloud's War, obviously Red Cloud was involved in that on the fighting against the U.S. side, as were American Horse, alias Washichu Tashunka, which really is more accurately translated, White Man's Horse, and Young Man Afraid of His Horses, also mistranslated. It should be something more along the lines of his horses are fear-inspiring. But the three of them, Red Cloud, American Horse, and Young Man Afraid of His Horses, had been involved in wrapping up that Red Cloud War and signing the peace treaty there in 1868. By the way, I forgot to mention when I was talking about the leaders on the war side in the previous picture that Morning Star, alias Dull Knife, had been present at the signing of the first treaty of Fort Laramie way back in 1851. By June of 1876, the numbers of native people in the region had swelled, as when the weather improved, even more Lakotas left the Great Sioux Reservation to go and join their relatives in rebellion. Numbers of Cheyenne grew and some Arapaho, to the extent that by that June there were 3,000 to 4,000 warriors, with perhaps 5,000 or so non-fighting age people, women, children, old people, and so forth. So 3,000 to 4,000 warriors. To compare the three columns of the U.S. Army that were entering into operation in the region at the same time, had about 2,500 troops, 2,500, plus several hundred scouts, the majority of whom were Native Americans, so 3,000 or so, 3,000 or so on the side of the U.S. Army, 3,000 to 4,000 on the side of the quote-unquote hostile Indians. Well, Sitting Bull had announced that he was going to do a sun dance to seek a vision for guidance. Now, by this point, he had become the most influential of all the leaders involved, in large part because not only did he have a good strategic mind, but he was also a deeply spiritual person and was, in fact, a medicine man. And Native people put a lot more trust in that even than they did military skill. So he announced that he was going to do a sun dance, and many bands came together to be a part of that whole ceremony and that whole atmosphere, so that there were just huge numbers. The majority of the Native people in the area were present. It was like, well, if you've ever been to a powwow, it was almost like a big powwow atmosphere with people from different allied tribes mingling together. And then Sitting Bull did, in fact, do the sun dance, where he hung suspended and went without food or water for 2 days, and cut his 2 arms repeatedly to speed along the process of physical privation, to bring about the right mental and spiritual attitude to be receptive to a vision. And when he was cut down, he reported that he had such a vision. In his vision, he had seen hundreds of blue-coated soldiers falling from the sky, head first, like a swarm of grasshoppers all over the ground, dead. And he said that a voice had told him, "I give these to you because they have no ears." Well, this was obviously interpreted as an omen for a great victory over the white people who just wouldn't listen. So, to use a more modern parlance, the folks there got really jazzed up about all this. They got very energized and became very confident. On June 15th, General Crook set out once more from Fort Fetterman, headed north in search of hostiles. He had about 950 troops with him, about 100 scouts. He did not have Colonel Reynolds, of course. He also was accompanied by some of those Shoshone and Crow who had come and offered their services, including two of the great leaders from each tribe. Washakie of the Shoshone, who had 86 warriors with him, and Plenty-Coup of the Crow, who had 175 with him. Both of these chiefs had very storied careers. Washakie was a little bit older than Plenty-Coup, who had a storied career yet ahead of him. Plenty-Coup, by the way, much like Sitting Bull, was a mystic in addition to being a strategist. So they head north, hoping to find some enemies to fight. Crook had his men getting up at 3 a.m. to start their march and had them marching double time all day, so they were pretty exhausted after a couple of days. He was hoping that they would be able to find the Lakota and Cheyenne and sneak up on them, but that was sort of messed up by the Shoshones and Crow, who came across some buffalo and started shooting them. So Crook was afraid they may have given away their advance with the sound of the gunfire. And in fact, they had. A force led by Crazy Horse came looking for them, actually. with about at least 1,000 warriors, some estimates as high as 1,800, but fairly evenly matched, really, roughly around the same number. Now, Crook had his men stopped for the night and hadn't really posted a heavy guard. They all just kind of dropped where they fell because they were exhausted. And it was the Shoshones and Crows who actually kept watch. And it's a good thing because they were able to detect the enemy. They came running into the camp yelling, Lakota, Lakota. And so they started the fight. The Lakota and Cheyenne and Arapahoes versus the Shoshones and Crows. And that gave enough time for Crook to get his men up and organized and ready to join in the fight. Whereas most Native American attacks traditionally had been guerrilla actions or really quick strikes and then quick withdrawals coming kind of in spurts or in waves, this time, under Crazy Horse, they just kept coming. The fighting lasted for hours with very little let up. General Crook assumed, incorrectly, that there must be a village, a large village, very close by, because that's the only reason he could imagine that these Indians would be fighting so hard. Although the fact is, they were fighting because they had been inspired and encouraged by Sitting Bull's vision, and they were just really ticked off. That helped too. Crook was fortunate that he had his Indian allies who had bought him some time. Otherwise, if they hadn't been there, the Lakotas and Cheyenne would have just swept through the camp, and it probably would have been a wholesale slaughter. As it was, there weren't a whole lot of casualties on either side. This happened along the Rosebud Creek, which is where this battle gets its name, the Battle of the Rosebud. Except among the Cheyenne, there's a different name for it, due to an incident that occurred during the battle when a Cheyenne warrior named Comes in Sight had his horse shot from under him, and so he was thrown off the horse and in danger of being killed when, from out of nowhere, came his sister, galloping on her own horse. Her name was Buffalo Calf Road Woman, and she rode up to him and scooped him up behind her on the horse and escaped, saving his life. And this impressed all the other Cheyenne so much that they called this battle the fight where the girl saved her brother. Crook called it a victory because he was still there in the roughly same spot when the fight was over, but it wasn't really a victory for him at all. They had been thoroughly chastised and embarrassed by their opponents. Crook then withdrew, made camp, and sent word that he needed reinforcements, and he didn't make too many more moves for a while after that. So the next part of the action, Crook won't be in because he and his men will be sitting there waiting for reinforcements. The Shoshones and Crows went home after this. Coming up next, Custer's Very Bad Day. So there were three columns, commanded respectively by Crook, Terry, and Gibbon, and they were all supposed to converge and meet up together, which Terry and Gibbon did, and Crook did not, because he was down there on the Tongue River after having his battle at the Rosebud and then retreating and hoping for reinforcements. So Terry and Gibbon are there by themselves. So that's 2/3 of the force they thought they were going to have. They then proceeded westward along the Yellowstone River with the intent of, when reaching the mouth of the Bighorn River, heading southward along that until they reached the spur known as the Little Bighorn River. Terry ordered Custer and his 7th Cavalry to scout to the south along Rosebud Creek. But it was expected that the Indian encampments were to the northwest. That's why they took the largest force there. So Custer was sent to scout and report back, although he was given permission to depart from those orders if it seemed necessary. General Terry offered to send some Gatling guns along with him, which was an early version of a machine gun. But Custer said, no thanks. That would just slow me down. So on June 22nd, the 7th Cavalry separated from Gibbon's column and headed south by southwest. The 7th Cavalry was composed of 31 officers, 566 enlisted men, and about 100 scouts, some of whom were civilian white scouts, but the majority of whom were either Arikara, which was the largest number, or Crow. So they headed along the Rosebud Creek and made camp about right here, and several of the Indian scouts continued going further southwest until they came to an overlook called the Crow's Nest that was a very high vantage point, especially for this area. And they sent word back that Custer needed to come join them as soon as possible because they had to show him something. So the following morning, he came out through there. He met with them. What is it? And they said, well, about 15 miles west of here, we see we can see a village, a huge village, the biggest village we've ever seen. There's got to be 2,000 or 3,000 people there. Custer couldn't see anything. Neither could the white scouts. The Indian scouts then told him, by the way, while we're on the subject, if we look to the other direction about 15 miles, we can clearly see the smoke from your campfire, and we can tell how many people are there. And if we can do that, so can the Indians in that huge village. Well, Custer may have believed that there could be a village there, but the idea that it could be so large was just, to him, ridiculous, because all the reports that he had received and that Gibbon and Terry had received was that there were no more than 800 hostiles in the area. That's what the Indian agents had reported. They got that number because that's about how many were off, quote unquote, off of the reservation with Sitting Bull when all this had started back in the winter. When they had been told that Sitting Bull's band and the others needed to come in at once. And there were about 800 of them out there. That failed to take into account all the Cheyenne that had joined them. And it failed to take into account the large number of Lakotas on the reservation who had left in the spring and gone and joined them. Also failed to take into account what his own scouts were telling him. The civilian scouts, the white guys, they couldn't see the same things that the Indians saw, but they trusted them. In fact, they told Custer, "Listen, I have never heard of a village this big, and they know what they're talking about." Custer, however, was not convinced. He did, however, decide that they needed to take some action. So the rest of the regiment caught up to the scouts, then realized that they had left some of their food supplies behind, so a detachment was sent back to their previous location to gather those, only to discover that in the short time since they had left, Indian pony tracks indicated that some natives had been there and had taken the food. In fact, it turns out this was a Cheyenne group led by Little Wolf. Well, that caused Custer some concern because he was fearful that this group, which was a small group, he wasn't fearful that they would attack, but rather that they would warn the others before the 7th Cavalry could get to them. So they stepped up their pace and headed west along what would later be known as Reno Creek, named after Custer's second-in-command. So I guess that's a good segue to mention some of the other people who were along, aside from Lieutenant Colonel Custer. His Second in command was Major Marcus Reno, and his third in command was Captain Frederick Benteen. There was another captain who was somewhat prominent in the action that took place after this that I don't have pictured here, Captain Miles Keogh, originally from Ireland. I do have pictured Captain Thomas Custer, George Custer's little brother, the one with 2 medals of honor. Also along was their even younger brother, Boston Custer, who was 27 years old, and their even younger nephew, Henry Armstrong Reed, alias Audie Reed, who was 18. Boston and Audie weren't even in the Army. They were among that number of civilian scouts. They also were classified as packers, foragers, guides, civilian contractors, which essentially you could argue they were basically hangers-on because the whole Custer clan was here. Audie, by the way, was the son of the 3 brothers' sister. So anyway, back to the story. After they went west about another 2.5 miles, they found a lone teepee with a dead Indian in it, which was actually a Sanzark Lakota warrior who had been mortally wounded a few days before fighting against General Crook's command at the Battle of the Rosebud. This had been the location of the village at that time. He had made it back to the village and had subsequently died in his own teepee. So when they picked up, the rest of them picked up their teepees and packed them up and headed on. Out of respect, they left his standing and left him there in it as his resting place. Of course, Custer's men had no way of knowing exactly what this was, but it must have been awfully darn spooky. Just a little bit past the lone teepee, when they were still 12 miles from the Little Bighorn River, Custer divided his regiment into 3 battalions. Now, he had 12 companies altogether. He assigned 3 companies to Reno, 3 companies to Benteen, and he took 5 companies, which left 1 other company that was left there at that spot to guard and protect the pack train. So there was going to be a 3-pronged attack against the village. The idea was that Reno would take his 3 companies and he would hit the village on the left bank of the river, on the west bank of the river, hit the southwest corner of the village. Custer would continue on up the river and cross it and come right into the middle of the village. And Benteen and his 3 companies were meant to be coming up from the southeast so that they could catch anybody that got away. This was the same basic, these were the same tactics Custer had used 8 years earlier at the Battle of the Washita, alias the Washita Massacre in Oklahoma against the Cheyenne. The idea being that anytime you get an opportunity to attack a village, do so. The more women and children are there, the better, because the warriors will retreat because they won't want to fight and endanger their family. Then you can capture the women and children and use them as hostages to try to get the warriors to surrender. So that was the plan, and that plan worked pretty well against a mostly peaceful Cheyenne village that had very few warriors in it. Turns out this was going to be a little bit different. I've decided to include what I think may be a direct quote, although translated, from one of the Crow scouts. Or words to that effect. In fact, one Crow scout did say, when translated, "We're all going to be going home today on a road that we're not used to," which is, a more poetic way of saying just that, what I wrote down there. Some of them began singing their death song because, from their perspective, this was not looking very good. Reno crossed the river and formed a skirmish line there in purple and started firing into the village, which he was only seeing the edge of it. He couldn't really see just how big it was, but he did immediately notice a whole great big bunch of Lakota and Cheyenne attacking him. So he was forced to fall back across the river on several different occasions, trying to put up some resistance, but basically retreating until he reached a hill there where his men entrenched, there where it says entrenchment. This hill is now called Reno Hill. And by entrenching, that means that they took out their knives or their tin plates or whatever they could find and dug in the dirt to get some cover and some protection. Benteen heard the shooting, and he rode to the west and came upon Reno on his hill and reinforced him there. As they were fighting, as the entrenchment was just beginning before Benteen got there, I believe that was the order. Bloody Knife, who had been with Reno's battalion, was shot in the head right next to Major Reno, splattered all over him. Some people say that kind of unnerved him a little bit, but they were there taking heavy casualties, and they heard a lot of gunfire coming from a little farther to the west. And all the Indians left them eventually and headed westward to join that party. And that, of course, was Custer's battalion. He had 210 men total, including all of his relatives who were along, and a reporter or two, I believe. And so they had proceeded on down the river a couple of miles. And then the fact they could proceed down the river a couple of miles and were still near the village should tell you something. Then he was going to proceed according to plan and charge right into the middle of the village, thinking that everyone would scatter, but they didn't scatter. In fact, by most accounts, he didn't make it across the river at all until he started to be overwhelmed with Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces. And he, too, was forced to fall back, taking very heavy losses all along the way until, like Reno, he made his way to a hill with those men who were still surviving from his command. And that's where, well, it's called Last Stand Hill. So that tells you how that one turned out. There was one horse named Comanche that was the only survivor of Custer's entire battalion there. Custer died with a bullet to the chest, and he also had a post-mortem bullet wound to the head. Native witnesses say that some of the soldiers shot themselves in the head to avoid even the chance of capture and torture. They were all dead by late afternoon, and then the warriors were able to turn their attention once more to Reno and Benteen, and that fighting on the Reno Hill continued until 9 p.m. that night, when finally it was too dark to kill more white people, I guess. And so that was an end to the fighting for then. And then afterward, Terry's column finally reached, coming from the other direction, and the Indians then moved on. The field was strewn with white bodies, which had all been stripped, scalped, mutilated. Altogether, there were 268 dead. 210 of those were Custer and his entire 5 companies. That means there were 58 killed from among Benton and Reno's group, and there was a further 55 that were wounded, 6 of whom died shortly thereafter of their wounds. 2 out of the 3 surgeons were killed. The Lakota called this battle the Battle of the Greasy Grass, which was their name for the river that the whites called the Little Bighorn. And it was a huge victory for them, and they celebrated afterward uninterrupted for most of the month of July. The rest of the country, not so much. This happened on June 25th. By the time word got back and the presses rolled and people were getting their newspapers and finding out about this, it was around the time of the 4th of July, Independence Day, July the 4th, 1876, which means not just any 4th of July. It was the centennial. It was the 100th birthday of America. And around that time, Americans were finding out that the greatest American hero had just been massacred by Indians. There was, of course, a national outcry for revenge, and the forces that would now be brought against the tribes of the Northern Plains would be much, much greater than they already were, much more determined and much more vengeful. The Battle of the Greasy Grass was the last big victory for the Lakotas and Cheyenne. Soon after the battle, the huge conglomeration of tribes and bands that had come together to make this force of thousands of people started to break apart and drift apart and kind of go their separate ways, even as more soldiers were being brought into the region. It was around this time that Colonel Nelson Miles and Colonel Ronald McKenzie were brought north with soldiers from Texas and Oklahoma to increase the military presence. So, to summarize, so far we've talked about the Battle of Powder River. That's where Reynolds attacked that Cheyenne village and stole a whole lot of horses and immediately lost them again. We talked about the Battle of the Rosebud, alias the fight where the girl saved her brother, which could also be called the fight where Crook saved his posterior when he withdrew. And then, of course, we talked about the Little Bighorn. 3 weeks after the Little Bighorn, the 5th Cavalry, commanded by Eugene A. Sakar, was operating down here in the southeastern corner of the map that we have shown in order to try to prevent any further Cheyenne warriors from leaving their territory and going up to join the fight or bring more weapons and ammunition. And it was at that time that the 5th Cavalry had a small skirmish with about half a dozen Cheyenne warriors along a place that would become known as War Bonnet Creek. And that's where this guy enters our narrative, William F. Cody, alias Buffalo Bill Cody. In his youth, in his late teens, in the early 1860s, he had been a member of the short-lived Pony Express. In the war against the Cheyenne of the late 1860s that ran concurrently with Red Cloud's war, he had served as a scout for this same cavalry regiment and this same commander. And at the end of that fighting in 1869, he had been discovered, as it were, by Ned Buntline, who was a famous pulp writer of the time, an author of dime novels, who took Buffalo Bill's very exaggerated stories about himself and made them into very popular dime novels. So Buffalo Bill was already a celebrity in 1876. In fact, not only did he have those things written about him, but he had already started his own performing troupe that was going around and on a small scale, smaller than it would be later when it was renamed Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show, reenacting various battles against Native Americans and stuff like that. And he was fresh off starring in a play about himself when he heard the news about the fighting that was now going on in this great Sioux War, and so he came and reattached himself again as scout to the 5th Cavalry. Well, on this particular occasion, during the skirmish with those half-dozen Cheyenne warriors, Cody shot and killed a Cheyenne warrior named Yellow Hand. At least that's the way it was conveyed and the way he became famous. It was actually a mistranslation. His name was Yellow Hair. Anyway, Custer called him Yellow Hand, killed him, and scalped him as revenge for Custer. This incident, greatly exaggerated and romanticized, would be reenacted over and over and over and over again down through the years by Custer in his traveling show, and later when he started investing in the making of movies about himself. And this is the time frame where this incident took place. Now, ordinarily, I wouldn't even go into so much detail about what seems to be, even though he became a celebrity overall, what seems to be just an incidental character to our larger story. But Buffalo Bill is going to re-enter our story later on. By the way, I realize now that at one point in the previous slide, I accidentally called Buffalo Bill Custer, which in my defense, Buffalo Bill, George Armstrong Custer, and Wild Bill Hickok all kind of looked a lot alike, and they were all flamboyant, arrogant attention seekers, although only 2 out of the 3 met a violent end. Buffalo Bill fortunately got into show business. After the Little Bighorn, the reunited columns of Crook and Terry decided they needed to make a swift pursuit of the quote-unquote hostiles. So to travel more quickly, they left their wagon train of supplies behind and tried to catch any of these bands that had participated in the defeat of Custer, and they had no luck. Eventually, by August 18th, Terry retired from the field with his men. Crook kept going, but he was in a bad spot because they had left their wagon train full of supplies, and his men were running out of food. Meanwhile, the Lakota and Cheyenne had set fire to the prairie, burning off most of the grass in the area, so Crook's men's horses and mules couldn't forage. This was called the Starvation March. Finally, Crook decided that he was going to send a contingent of 150 men under 3rd Cavalry Captain Anson Mills to the eastward to the town of Deadwood to try to get some supplies there. And he ordered the captain, don't get involved in any fights because our main concern right now is getting food. So if you encounter an Indian village, just go around it. Mills did, in fact, encounter a village on his way at a place called Slim Buttes. It was a collection of Ogallala, Minneconjou, Brule, and Cheyenne, including American Horse the Elder, who had left the reservation with many other Lakotas to go out in the spring, having left to go out and join the forces of Crazy Horse. Well, there were a total of 260 people around in this village, 37 lodges. 30 or 40 of them were adult males, warriors. The remainder, of course, were women and children and some old people. Mills went ahead and attacked them, and in fact killed a significant number of women and children. American horse wound up being killed as well. There was resistance that was put up. There were a few losses on the side of Captain Mills. Eventually, a larger Ogallala force led by Crazy Horse came onto the scene, and there was a brief skirmish with them. However, the U.S. Army was able to proclaim this incident, the Battle of Slim Buttes, as their first major victory in this war against the Lakota and Cheyenne. Later, when the fighting was over and the soldiers were going through the contents of the abandoned teepees of the village, they found, among other things, a guidon or flag from the 7th Cavalry and a pair of bloody gloves whose inscription indicated they had belonged to the Irish-born Captain Miles Keogh of the 7th Cavalry. Around this time, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull split up, each leading a large group of Lakotas, heading out and directing their thoughts primarily to the fall hunt, to the need to kill enough buffalo to store the meat to last their families through the winter. Crazy Horse led his group to the west, and Sitting Bull led his northward along the Canadian border. Sitting Bull discovered that there were now a large number of soldiers along the Missouri River. A camp had been established there by Colonel Nelson Miles, and the supply wagons that were coming to provide material for the camp were scaring off the buffalo. So Sitting Bull actually left a note. He had a translator write it and left it in a rock where he knew the soldiers would find it, that essentially said, "My whole life, everywhere I go, soldiers try to fight me. Now they're trying to fight me here, and all I'm doing is hunting buffalo. Please get out," which, of course, didn't work. So there were several skirmishes in October, early to mid-October, with the Lakotas attacking the supply wagons a couple of times. Finally, Colonel Miles came out to negotiate with Sitting Bull. The negotiations did not go well, and what wound up happening is that the Lakotas then tried to withdraw, and when they did, they set fire to the prairie so that the smoke could cover their disappearing act, and the soldiers opened fire and at a place called Cedar Creek, and the bands split into two groups. One headed south, right into the arms, really, of Miles and his soldiers, and surrendered and agreed to go back to the reservation. Although fewer than half of them actually did, the others went west and joined Crazy Horse's group. Sitting Bull, meanwhile, with only about 240 people, headed north, where they had another skirmish at a place called Bark Creek in December. But by the first of the year, 1877, Sitting Bull and his people had crossed the border into Canada and refused to come back, even though at one point they were offered amnesty if they would come back and go to the reservation. The Canadian government negotiated with Sitting Bull and his people, and they seemed to get along well. He even made peace up there in Canada with the Blackfeet, who were the Hunkpapa Lakota's traditional enemies. So Sitting Bull would stay up there, he and his people, for about 4 years. So it was good in that there were no American soldiers shooting at them. It was not so good in as much as there weren't as many buffalo. They were kind of hard to come by, and feeding the group became increasingly difficult. At around the same time as those October conflicts between Miles and Sitting Bull, General Sheridan was cracking down hard on those Lakota who had remained on the reservation, or in some cases come back to. He ordered the arrest of Red Cloud, charging that Red Cloud had refused to name names and turn over any Lakotas who had left the reservation, gone off and fought with the hostiles, and then come back. That turned out to be only a temporary imprisonment. He also shared and ordered the confiscation of weapons. They took the guns away from the Lakotas who were on the Great Sioux Reservation and took away a lot of their horses as well, so that they wouldn't be able to smuggle those things to the hostiles outside the reservation, or, take their gun, get on their horse, and go join them, or in some cases, join them again. The Senate passed the Sioux Appropriation Bill, which took away all Lakota land rights outside the boundaries of the Great Sioux Reservation. In November, Colonel Ronald Mackenzie found a huge Cheyenne village. It was the combined bands of Little Wolf and Dull Knife, aka Morning Star, and attacked them. Mackenzie had about 1,000 troops. He also had about 400 Native American scouts, most of them Shoshone and Pawnee, although he had, at this point, some Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho scouts who had come in on the U.S. government side. The village was celebrating. They had had a big victory over a Shoshone village, because remember, the Cheyenne and Lakota, while they're fighting the U.S. government, were also fighting the Shoshone and the Crow. Well, Mackenzie swept in at dawn, much as he had done at the Comanche stronghold on the Llano Estacado just a few years before this. Swept in at dawn, and the, kind of the same scenario that has played out several times. The Cheyenne were forced to flee. About 40 of them were killed, including 3 of Dull Knife's sons. The ones who escaped, which was most of them, they escaped, but they did not bring with them their teepees, their robes, and so forth. So, as well as their food stores, which Mackenzie got a hold of. So even though they managed to escape, they're out there in the very beginning of a hard northern winter without enough food and without shelter and without even adequate clothing. And quite a few, particularly young children, would freeze to death in the next month or two. Now, some of the Cheyenne made their way to Crazy Horse's force and joined up with Crazy Horse, which Two Moons, the Cheyenne leader, was already there with him. Which means they joined up with Crazy Horse and Two Moons just in time to participate on January the 8th in the Battle of Wolf Mountain, also known as the Battle of the Butte, in which they were attacked by Miles and his soldiers. It was kind of a draw, kind of moved back and forth, but it had a huge effect, because realizing now that the U.S. Army would even move through the snow in the middle of a harsh winter and descend upon them and attack them, made a lot of the Indians feel like they just couldn't catch a break. There's no time that they can be safe. So many more came back into the reservation and surrendered. The Cheyenne surrendered in hopes that they would be given a reservation, at least similar to what the Lakotas had, but that was not in the cards from the U.S. government, at least not then. Instead, they were told they had to go join the Southern Cheyenne on that reservation down in Oklahoma. So about 1,000 Cheyenne, and there weren't a whole lot more left than that, agreed to that, and they made their way. They were taken down there to Oklahoma. Now, in the following months, in the early spring, people came out from the reservation, leaders who had been promoting peace, such as Spotted Tail. He came out on several trips to meet with various bands who were still out there in the unceded lands to convince them to come onto the reservation and surrender, and he was very effective. Many of them did. Finally, Red Cloud went out and talked with Crazy Horse, who had also been approached by Spotted Tail and had repeatedly said, absolutely not, no way. We're going to continue this fight as long as we're breathing. But Red Cloud convinced him that there wasn't much chance of even survival for the people who followed him if he continued in that course. So Crazy Horse agreed to also come on to the reservation and surrender. This was in early May, the beginning of May. There was one more little skirmish a few days after that at a place called Lame Deer. But aside from that, at this point, the Great Sioux War was over, and so was the autonomy, any semblance of autonomy for the Lakota or the Cheyenne or the Arapaho, who were confined to the Wind River Reservation with the Shoshone. But that's still not quite the end of the story of the Great Sioux War, because there are a couple of sad codas to it. First, let's take a look at territory. So here are the territories that were assigned, the tribal territories assigned by the U.S. government in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. And this particular image also has the little red dots, the locations of every battle between the Lakota and the United States government after 1851. So that includes the Red Cloud War and the Great Sioux War and all the smaller things that happened before and after those. And you'll notice almost all of them are in the area outside what had been assigned to the Lakota. Most of them, in fact, are there along the Yellowstone River in the area the government called Crow Country, but which, of course, the Lakota did not acknowledge. Nonetheless, this is what their territory was as of the 1851 treaty. And these are the Lakota lands as per the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, the one that ended Red Cloud's War and established the Great Sioux Reservation, which is there in light blue. But all those orange areas, unceded Indian territory, were still technically Lakota territory. They were off the reservation, and this included some of the stuff that they had been contending with the Crows over. So there's the location again of the Great Sioux Reservation. Bear in mind, in early 1877, when technically the war was still going on, Congress took all that unceded territory away, so that the only Sioux territory after that was the Great Sioux Reservation, the only Lakota. Well, that Great Sioux Reservation, later in 1877, was divided into 4 smaller, separate reservations: Pine Ridge, Rosebud, the Cheyenne River Reservation, and Standing Rock. Now, don't be confused. Cheyenne River Reservation is not a Cheyenne reservation. Cheyenne is the name of the river. It's the Lakota Cheyenne River Sioux. You also can see here the location not only of various forts, but of Indian agencies that we've mentioned several times already. So until 1889, the areas in between those four smaller reservations technically were still Indian land. They were sort of like the new unceded lands. They were well, they were going to be that way until the Dawes Act is what's going to change that in 1889. But we haven't quite gotten there yet. But spoiler alert, 1889, they do lose all those parts formerly of the Great Sioux Reservation in between the smaller ones. So these are the reservations as they are today. The Crow Creek Lakota and the Lower Brule Lakota have their own very small ones as well right there. But that's where it is today. Take a look at that. And then take a look back at what the territories were of all the three branches of the Sioux Nation at the time of first contact with the United States in the early 1800s. That's the green. The little brown blotches are the areas that are held as reservations today, not just of the Lakota, but also of the Dakota and Nakota, or Yankton and Yanktoni. As mentioned previously, Crazy Horse came in and surrendered in early May of 1877, accompanied by those who were still with him, including two of his closest Ogallala comrades, He Dog and Little Big Man, not to be confused with the Little Big Man of fiction and the Dustin Hoffman movie. It's a fictional character who was Cheyenne. This is a real Lakota named Little Big Man. So they came in to the agency and surrendered, promised to be peaceful. There was a huge sun dance held that summer to commemorate the 1 year anniversary of their victory at Little Bighorn, and Crazy Horse was the guest of honor. That would be the last sun dance that would be held for a very long time, almost 100 years, at least out in the open, that government was aware of. Anyhow, as he's there on the reservation, the what's now the Pine Ridge Reservation, some of the folks who were already there and had been and had not really left to join in the fighting, like Red Cloud and Spotted Tail in particular, felt threatened by Crazy Horse's presence because some of the people viewed him as a great hero and an image of resistance, and were hoping that he would lead yet another war foray, and were eager for that to happen. Another segment of the population, pretty big segment actually, thought of him as a troublemaker, and they were fearful that if he did not acquiesce, if he did not stay bowed under, basically, that he would bring more trouble and more death upon them. Some people say that Red Cloud and Spotted Tail were jealous of all the attention, honor, and affection that Crazy Horse received. Others would say that it was more their fear of what he might do, because he, although he came and lived peaceably, he and Touch the Clouds, his cousin, the Miniconjou, refused to help the U.S. Army as scouts to fight against Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce that we'll be talking about later. And there were rumors going around, whether founded or unfounded, that Crazy Horse wasn't planning on staying on this reservation, but that he was planning to lead another resistance. And the military found out about that. They were quite quite disturbed, quite nervous about it. Meetings were held with Crazy Horse in which there were misinterpretations through the interpreters. There was disagreement among the interpreters of how to phrase what Crazy Horse was saying. But the story got around that what he had said was he's going to kill all the white people. So, as the tension mounted, once again he was pressured to come in for a meeting, and he agreed to come in to Fort Robinson and have yet another meeting to assuage the fears of both the government and certain elements of his own people. And so he came there for what he thought was going to be diplomatic negotiation. And when he got inside the fort, he saw there were a whole lot of soldiers there, along with a whole lot of Indian police. These were Lakotas who were essentially helping the government to police their own people, and his own friend, Little Big Man, had become one of them. And he saw them approaching him with handcuffs. So they did attempt to handcuff him, and he resisted. And as he was resisting, Little Big Man held his arms while another a soldier stabbed him with a bayonet. And he was then he was taken to the doctor at the fort, but he died around midnight, and his body was given to his parents, who buried him in a secret location so that no one could disturb his grave. So that was the end of the great, brilliant strategist and tactician Crazy Horse. And like I said, that is a very sad coda to the fighting and the things that had happened over the previous several years. Sitting Bull and his band finally came down from Canada and surrendered to the United States government in 1881. They came down because it was not feasible for them to stay. They couldn't find enough food. There just weren't enough buffalo. So they surrendered and were imprisoned for 20 months at Fort Randall in Dakota Territory, then released and allowed to return to the Standing Rock Agency. He wasn't at Standing Rock very long before he was contacted by Buffalo Bill and received permission from the government to leave the reservation to go work in Buffalo Bill's traveling Wild West show, because he was quite a celebrity. Well, they both were. So for some time after that, Sitting Bull was earning the equivalent today of about $1,500 a week for riding one time around the arena each night and signing autographs. Then he returned to the reservation. After that, it was during his time, of course, with Buffalo Bill that the incident I like to tell the story about, where he was passing his pay, most of the money that he made, he distributed to poor homeless children in whatever state or whatever city they were performing in. One other interesting coda to this story. A century later, after the associated, various associated Lakota tribes had brought lawsuits against the United States, which went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was ruled by the Supreme Court that the United States government under President Grant in 1876 had totally and completely and wrongly violated the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 when they allowed all those miners to come into Lakota territory and to the Black Hills, and in fact had therefore precipitated the war that ensued, in which those lands were ultimately taken away from the Lakota, wrongly, as the court ruled. Well, that's fine, but what are you going to do about it? The court ruled that the various Lakota tribes should be compensated fair market value for their land, which was, a lot of money. It's several $100 million. But they refused to take it because they don't want to take it. They don't want the money. They want their sacred hills back. And if they took the money, that would mean they were acknowledging they have no further claim on the Black Hills. So that money's still sitting there, I guess, gathering interest. And the Black Hills are still there being visited by tourists. Little Wolf and Dull Knife, alias Little Coyote and Morning Star, were taken along with their people down to the Southern Cheyenne Reservation in western Oklahoma, and none of them liked it very much. It was no place like home, for one thing. For another thing, there were so many people crowded there that disease was rampant, and several of them died. And probably the biggest concern is that, like Sitting Bull, they had a hard time finding enough for their people to eat. The buffalo had been pretty well wiped out in that area by that time. In fact, when they went out, they were allowed to leave the reservation to hunt buffalo. And when they did, all they found were skeletons or rotting carcasses left behind by buffalo hunters, or in some cases, by the U.S. Army. And they decided, yeah, this is not for us. And they decided it was time to go home, whether the U.S. government wanted them to or not.